Thank you very much for joining us on the online Creativity and Culture Conference. On behalf of University for Life, let's welcome Dr. Karl K. Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries is a senior lecturer in design at the University of Central Lancashire in England. He's based in the UK. The title of Dr. Jeffries' speech is "What is Creativity and How Can Creativity be Assessed?"
Hi, my name's Dr. Karl K. Jeffries, and I've been fascinated by the study of creativity for almost 20 years now. If you're going to watch this video through to the end, then I guess you're fascinated too. Perhaps you're curious about what is creativity and maybe how can creativity be assessed. I'm going to give you answers to both of those questions in this video. At this point, I'd prefer to give more background that will frame the answers I'll provide. That's because I love the depth and detail of this topic, but I don't want to overload you with information and ideas if you're new to this. So I've added that information in a separate video, which you can find on my Twitter account. If you have the headspace after completing this video, check it out. Now, as I don't know what your definition of creativity is, to begin this process of discussion, I'd like to set out for you how I, as a creativity researcher, define creativity, and I'll discuss how I assess it. In this way, we can begin to see the areas of commonality and difference between us, and that's the aim here. You don't have to agree with me. What I want is for you to understand where I'm coming from and to offer some useful terms to describe your own perspective. We're going to try to begin to use a shared language. I will ask you to do 3 exercises in this video that will require you to write things down. Clearly, you don't have to follow this process to get value from the content. I won't be spying on you through the monitor, but in my experience, taking the time to do the exercises will only add to your understanding. Exercise 1. I'd like you to consider the question, in your opinion, how would you define creativity? What is it? I've set aside 1 minute in this video for you to do this, and I'd like you to write down your thoughts so you can reflect upon them in the following exercises. Okay, let's start. How would you define creativity? Welcome back. So you have some notes on what creativity is for you. I'm going to get you to reflect on those notes using 2 models from creativity research. The first model is that creativity researchers broadly categorize what they do into 4 areas of study. These have become known as the 4 Ps of creativity research. And though you may not know it yet, your notes are going to fit one or several of those categories. These categories are the person, the process, the product, and the press. Press is shorthand to describe the creative climate, culture, or environment. In a moment, I want you to review your notes and decide which parts of your definition are associated with which of these 4 core areas: person, process, product, press. They're fairly self-explanatory, but let me add a little more detail before you begin. Person relates to the characteristics of the person who's being creative. Sometimes people say that someone is a creative person. When I've heard that said, it tends to imply a person is a non-conformist, tends to break the rules, sometimes linked with a kind of mystery or even a madness. I'm sure you have your own associations for a creative personality. Process is how someone or a group goes about being creative. It's the things they do either physically or mentally. It could be tacit, it could be conscious. It's whatever their creative process involves. Product is about the creative output, the final artwork, the book, the theory, the performance. In this respect, product has a very broad interpretation rather than just the association with physical objects in a conventional 2D or 3-dimensional way. Press is a funny word to use. One of the best reasons I've heard for the word press is it relates to the pressure that comes from social, cultural, environmental and external influences. You can think of it as the place where creativity takes place, but it can be more abstract than that, so keep that in mind. Exercise 2. With these 4 categories, person, process, product and press, I'd like you to consider where does your definition or notes on creativity fit. One of them, several of them, none of them. So once again, I'll give you a minute to think about what you've written down and how that falls into one or more of these 4 categories. Welcome back. Did you find your ideas belong to one area more than another? The point, I hope, that comes across are that there are different views on how to define what creativity is. You may belong more to the process view or more to the person view and so on. The issue then is that depending on your viewpoint, other folk may disagree or agree with you because they hold the same or different perspective. And it's useful to know what your viewpoint is when considering other people's definitions. What you need to know about me as a creativity researcher is I preference the creative product over the other 3 areas. Now, I know it's going to sound horrific to some of you, and others are saying, sure, Karl, it's not a problem. I'm not alone in this view. Many creativity researchers consider creative product to be a more useful construct when it comes to researching creativity. The reason is that in order to validate that someone has a creative process, creative personality, or being influenced by a creative environment, you probably need to validate that through the creative product at some point. This is a point for debate, but we need to leave that for the moment. The second model I find useful is the 4C model of creativity. As a researcher, I'm interested in the creativity of designers and how they transition from design higher education into professional creative practice. This type of creativity has become known as Pro-C creativity or professional creativity. And like the 4P model, I believe this kind of distinction is important when we talk about creativity. I'm specifically referring to the work of James C. Kaufman and Ronald Bagetto. They highlight that it's useful to see creativity in 4 different but interrelated ways: mini C creativity, little c creativity, pro C creativity, big C creativity. In their paper, mini C is defined as the novel and personally meaningful interpretation of experiences, actions and events. It's not miniature creativity, mini C, in the sense of importance, but in the amount of social recognition the creative output receives. Social recognition is an important term and concept within creativity research. After mini C, little c, pro C, and big C are each characterized by differing levels of social recognition. When you think of the achievements of great minds that have fundamentally shaped the world we live in, then we're talking about big C creativity. Pro C is recognized within a profession, and little c is associated with educational achievements. Now, what I realized recently was, for me, mini C is not mini, it is core to creativity. Why is that important? Well, changing the term from mini C to core creativity releases us from some assumptions or misinterpretations people can have about the 4C model. And I offer this to you too as a small adjustment to the 4C model of creativity. If core creativity is defined as novel and personally meaningful interpretation of actions, experiences and events, then after this has occurred, I have no issue with the idea that there can be varying levels of social recognition when it comes to creative achievement, and that they can occur on a spectrum. Social recognition could start with a teacher in kindergarten or a tutor in an introductory class and end with a Nobel Prize committee. Indeed, I think it's fundamentally important that we acknowledge this spectrum when we talk about creativity and not try and conflate these into a single term. Hence the terms that are useful: core creativity or mini creativity, little c, pro C and big C creativity. Let's take another minute to reflect upon those notes from exercise 1. Does your definition lean more towards one of the 4 C's of creativity than the others? Welcome back. How is all this useful? Well, if I said I'm mostly interested in the creative products of pro C creativity, I hope you have a clear idea on my specific perspective on creativity. In contrast, if you think your notes reflect a perspective on the creative process or mini C or core creativity, it's likely we're coming from different perspectives on this subject. Both perspectives matter, but they're not the same. And that difference is massively important if we're going to have a debate on how we assess creativity. So let's look a bit further at what creativity researchers have to say about assessing creative products. There is some degree of consensus within creativity research on the characteristics of a creative product. The standard definition is based on 2 criteria: novelty and usefulness. These terms can change depending on who you talk to, but the idea is that one criteria is only good with the other. Usefulness without novelty is resourceful but not creative. Novelty without usefulness is likely to be weird but not creative. Only the combination of both these qualities together is enough to characterize a creative output. Other scholars think the emphasis on usefulness needs to be weighted in favour of novelty, and some believe novelty and usefulness are not enough. You also need to experience surprise when you encounter creativity. Pretty much everybody agrees that novelty is important, and it's partly the position that I take. I understand the focus on other criteria like novelty and surprise, but I'm aware of studies exploring the design process that have shown that even weird creative ideas, i.e. novel but not useful, can lead on to more acceptable creative outcomes further down the line. So if you had to pin me down to set criteria, I'd opt for novelty only. But my actual preference is not to set any criteria at all, or what has been described as being theoretically neutral. Here's why and how this relates to assessing creativity. Back in the early 1980s, a creativity researcher called Teresa Amabile argued that objective methods did not currently exist and may never exist on which to assess creativity in this way. Think about that. A complete set of criteria to assess creativity may never exist. I liken it to the holy grail of creativity research. Indeed, she argued that the judgments required to assess creativity can ultimately only be creative, and as such, with an appropriate group of judges, is something that people can recognize when they see it. Let's repeat that idea. The judgments required to assess creativity can ultimately only be subjective, but with an appropriate group of judges, creativity is something they can recognize when they see it. Using this as a working definition of creativity, Amabile moved away from the notion of objectivity in assessment and towards subjectivity. The question then was, to what degree can judges actually agree on each other's subjective opinions? The answer was quite a bit, more than you might expect. By basing assessment on the judge's subjective opinion, this negates the need for explicit criteria, thus the idea of being theoretically neutral. As long as the judges are in agreement, then that is enough. They may not know specifically why a product has a certain level of creativity, but if they agree it does, then that shall form the basis for evaluation. Given such a radical departure from assessment norms at the time, she presented a way of assessing creativity called the consensual assessment technique, or less formally now called the CAT. That was over 30 years ago, and in between time the use of the CAT has grown. It's become a well-regarded measure of creativity within creativity research, and hundreds of studies have taken place that use it to explore the science of creativity. It's also my preferred way to assess creativity in my own research studies. So, to sum up, when I hear folks say that the problem with creativity is you can't define it, or that it is not able to be assessed, my first reaction is to conclude they've never studied the topic. I'm of the view that once a person is more informed on the 4 P's of creativity research, the 4C model, standard definition of creativity, consensual assessment technique, they're less inclined to say such statements with any confidence or dismiss the study of creativity outright. I believe creativity research offers profound knowledge to help enhance our potential for creative thinking, problem solving and innovation. I'm not alone in that view, and if the future develops into the automated, AI-driven knowledge economy some think it will, then like others have said before, the ability to be creative will be a crucial asset, perhaps the crucial asset. Indeed, at the first UK Creativity Researchers Conference in Edinburgh, in his keynote speech, Professor Giovanni Corazza went as far as to say that future generations will look back and in retrospect, creativity will be recognised to have been the most important field in philosophy, psychology and cognitive sciences for the 21st century. That's a major claim, and if he's right, then the science and study of creativity is fundamental. I hope you liked the video, and if you have any questions, drop me a line. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. All right, so Dr. Karl Jeffries, thank you very much for that wonderful speech that you've just delivered. And I found it really interesting, your thoughts on the creative process, the 4 C's of creativity. And I like the fact that you appreciate and you acknowledge the fact that not everyone has the same definition of creativity. In that first exercise that you introduced, I'm sure that if we were to ask all the audience what their definition of creativity would be, we'd have a different answer for the number of people who actually wrote that definition. And in the academic world, as you rightly say, that there is a general consensus that creativity needs to include some sort of novelty, which may be called originality or surprise or something different, and also the concept of value, which we could say is useful or effective. But those 2 concepts there's general consensus about. But apart from that, there are so many different definitions of creativity. And what I'm particularly interested in, I know that you've introduced the 4 P's, the process, the product, the press, and the actual person who is creative. What I'm particularly interested in is the persuasion factor in creativity, because as we know, there are those who are very persuasive about their creativity and those who are recognized for being creative and others who are not. And one of the questions related to this is that when I speak about my creativity research, people are often referring me to other creativity researchers. And the odd thing about it is that all the people that they refer me to, they're usually white male. Now, I thought I would ask you this question because you're an academic, and the only academic that I was able to attract to speak at this conference, and you yourself are a white male. So I thought it would be interesting to ask your thoughts on why this should be so.
So when you ask people, you know, who's a creative person or something like that, and people give you these white male responses.
They usually to people like yourself, you see. So there's like a strangeness about that. That why
so not necessarily so academics, so actual people who are doing creativity research, they tend to come across as white males. Yeah, gosh, it's hard to, you know, I am one of those. Whether it's, I mean, I know there are female researchers for a start. So, and you know, esteemed in terms of academia. You know, Teresa Marbollet and various other people. So it's not like there aren't creativity researchers who are female. And then again, I suppose it's just there's a big emphasis that's come out of America for creativity research, and psychology has been a big area, and maybe there's an ethnicity angle there with possibilities in terms of backgrounds and who the sort of ethnicity of people who do a psychology degree and then go on to do you know, go and research into creativity about it. But they are there, but whether there's whether people keep pointing you in that direction for, you know, just because that's their own social kind of group of folk that they know about, difficult to say.
Well, the thing that I'm exploring in particular around this issue of persuasion and recognition is the impact of attractiveness and authority. Because when I've spoken at conferences across the world now over the last 4 or 5 years that I've been researching, what I've noticed is that people who get selected to speak at those conferences, either it's to do with their attractiveness, which can include their likability, they're familiar with the person who's, the people who are the gatekeepers for the conference. There's that familiarity. So there's that kind of attractiveness about them. And then there's the authority factor, so that even if they are not known to the gatekeepers, they have authority. And I suppose the authority in terms of their status, their titles, the books they've written, what they've done previously, gets them through that gate. The gatekeepers select them. What are your thoughts on that, Karl?
Yeah, I think you could probably look at the number of, I work closely with Professor Labaina Himid, who's been nominated for a Turner Prize. And I think she would rightly say that the number of black female professors in the UK, she's an elite club in terms of, predominantly they're white and they're male and they're of a certain age and they're of a certain class. That tend to make it into the professorial. So, and again, that part of that social recognition comes back to the committees and what's seen as appropriate for the academy to sanction in its own way. So you have a growing development of stuff coming through, but you've also got a quite aged tradition that's been associated with who's got tenureship and who's got professorial positions, so who's been given that opportunity. But again, in my generation, I don't notice it as much. So I know plenty of female professors and but yeah, I wouldn't like to see the stats on that. In terms, I wouldn't be surprised if it's still quite skewed towards in its gender alignment and also in its maybe even, I would say gender predominantly, perhaps, but perhaps race as well.
And then that leads us to the question of where to publish our journal, because as you know, as a professor yourself, it's very important that.
Well, I'm not a professor. I'm a senior lecturer, so I'm 2 down from the hierarchy of hitting that one yet.
In order to be a professor, you would need to publish in journals that are of high academic credibility. So that again is to do with the authority in being persuasive. That to be a professor, if you haven't, you might have published on the internet and have millions of people who've read your articles or seen your videos, but that still wouldn't necessarily give you the credibility in the world of academia. So again, it's to do with that authority. Like what is it that gives you the authority?
I think as well, I think there's a factor here as well when I'm kind of involved in these sorts of things, of a bias towards creativity research as well. And so the challenge that I face sometimes, and I know a number of other kind of researchers face, is a predominant scientific professorial committees and university communities at times are made up of quite science-based disciplines and ethos. And when creativity research can be seen to be not sciencey enough for the scientists and too sciencey for the arts, so you end up with this sort of awkward territory where you're seen as trying to control and objectify and measure something that the artistic community thinks it predominantly is undefinable, and yet in the science community they kind of think, well, they're not too sure about whether that's really realistic science, this sort of subjective area of creativity. So you're in a fascinating sort of, I think it's changing, but I think there's a fascinating bias there between the two. So when you do go forward to the professorial stuff, you are in a position of how many people on that committee are from an art and design background, if you're doing creativity research. And then even if they are, whether how they're going to feel about the sort of, even if you've got the publications. So even if you publish in various journals, Journal of Creative Behavior, creativity research, psychology of aesthetics, creativity in the arts, all of these are key kind of journals to debate creativity. But they're not necessarily known outside, they're not necessarily known in other areas of the hard sciences or the hard arts. And so, you're in a challenging situation, I think, which is why these conferences and the stuff I'm interested in is trying to raise that credibility, really, of which some of that again comes back to funding. How much funding is given towards creativity research relative to more traditional either classic arts or classic science type of work. So we've still got a ceiling to hit as researchers on that front as well. We do, like I say, we do get people make assumptions about what it is and what creativity is, and then whether there can be a science of creativity, but not necessarily from an informed perspective. It's just they view it as possibly genius, big C creativity, and they see it as maybe person orientated. So they're kind of, I don't know what their complete perceptions of it are, but I know that's a common thing that I experience as a researcher, that sort of bias that kind of fits into from the academy, I suppose.
Yes, you've hit a very, very important, a fundamentally important issue, Karl, and that is the issue of funding, what gets funded and what doesn't. So that's again related to authority, because you'll find that the projects that attract the funding are the ones that will have the credibility, more authority. And in 1950, when in America, that famous conference where it was Guilford who made that announcement about the importance of research into creativity, because he acknowledged that there was so little research into creativity in the 1950s. And then a lot of money was put into creativity research because there was seen to be a military link, that in terms of military advancement, especially in America, they thought it was very important to fund creativity research. But then over the years, in the 60s, when people started to use creativity in non-conformist ways, then the funding seemed to diminish, or it fizzled out. So what are your thoughts on that, Karl?
Yeah, I think that the whole development and credibility of creativity research is sort of established for me in some respects, in terms of, there are major players and people I certainly look up to, and there is a body of work there, indeed, like tracing back to the 50s and Guilford's APA address, and we've moved on from that. So we've been around quite a while. At the same time, it seems to go through cycles, and it also goes through cycles in different places of the world. So, maybe 15 years ago in the UK, when I was applying for funding, people were throwing money at me to do stuff with creativity diagnostics, and now it's a lot harder. And yet I talk to some of my students and people in Singapore and stuff like that, and they're really interested in it. And so I sometimes think this creativity research side of things moves around. And having said that, I can't see how it can go away. I'm obviously I'm biased towards this, but I'm sold on the idea that creativity is a fundamental, let's call it an ability, that people will require more of as we move into an automated kind of knowledge economy. And how we help people to be more creative and develop their creativity is important to understand, and important to know what works, and for it to be less of a there'll always be an art to teaching, but there's have some actual evidence base where we can go, that actually works, that technique does help, or that approach to creativity training does deliver. So I think the funding kind of depends where the country you're in, and the time, as to whether people are, whether it's on the agenda or not in the way that it was. So nowadays, again, innovation is a more popular word than creativity. So again, and I've come across researchers who've been told, maybe you should take this creativity word out of your research grant because it's not helping you. These are major people in the field. So again, all I can say is, we have to kind of keep in there. I think you find a love of a topic, and regardless of whether you have to cut your cloth a bit to the climate, but at the same time, whether you're in favor or you're not, if you see a value in it, you keep going on it, you keep exploring it. So, but it would be nice, and I think we can. I mean, I'm certainly pushing that envelope to say, you should fund some of this stuff, and it's credible, and it's relevant, and it ticks all the boxes that you could want as a funder. So just let's get going, sort of thing.
Yes, and that's an important thing again that you've raised, the importance of time and place. That for creativity to flourish, you have to be in the right place at the right time. So when we think about the Renaissance, for example, that period of time in Italy where people were being funded for just doing their art, doing what they loved, and we have examples like that all over the world. China, for example, now, even though we don't associate creativity with the education system in China, which tends to be very formulaic, there's a lot of interest in creativity in order to be competitive in the global economy. And I suppose maybe when people advise you to take out the word creativity from your grant proposals, they'd prefer to use the word innovation, because innovation has an economic value, whereas creativity doesn't necessarily have an economic value that is explicit.
Sure. And again, we could say these are synonymous terms, innovation and creativity, but we could also say that innovation is the kind of commodification. It's the end result that leads to the purchase or the acknowledgement, whereas creativity could lead to someone could come up with something very new and very useful, and it just doesn't happen, a great invention that doesn't move forward for lots of different reasons. The challenge is I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the creativity, not necessarily the commodification of it and the turning of it into I think there's a different skill set, if you will, between coming up with the ideas and being someone who can profit from them, as well as I see the challenges here, because in some regard, when we're talking about big C creativity and professional creativity and little c creativity, as I discussed in the video, they're all about social recognition, and they're all about how much, I guess, somebody or a group of people have been able to persuade gatekeepers that they are creative, novel, new, all the way up to that Nobel Prize committee. But some of that stuff is out. I'm sure you can influence it, but I think there's a lot of factors that are there's a lot of lobbying that maybe goes on. There's a lot of luck that might come into it as well, as to who gets selected and who doesn't. So it's, again, it's not a lot you as an individual or as a team may be able to shift some of those things. So yeah, again, the stuff with the Nobel Prize and things like that, they tend to be regressive. They tend to be regressive. I mean, they tend to give them previously to the previous work you did. They're not giving it to work right now. It has to have been socially acknowledged for sort of some time, and it seems to be well established before they kind of say this is worthy of big C creativity.
Yes,
so,
yes.
So you know, you can't control that as an inventor or as a scientist or as a designer. You know.
No, and that's where a lot of creatives fall in terms of their lack of skills in knowing what's required to be persuasive in society, in the culture, so that they're making that explicit impact, which is seen by the gatekeepers at the Nobel Prize, for example. You know, they, as you say, they need to have seen evidence of you having made that impact.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think, you know, as a professional designer as well, you have to persuade the client. You have to persuade them that this is. But who gives you the award for that advertising campaign or whatever that you can put in for it? But you know, there's a number of factors there that decide how you're going to be selected, that to some extent you don't have a massive control over. You and sometimes I think if you try and overly shape it into an algorithm to fit the zeitgeist, you're kind of possibly missing the point of this as well. And again, I think there's that tension there between people who are pushing the envelope of what's novel for them, and then the world catching up with whether it thinks it's novel, and then people who are trying to hit a brief or establish a success that may, you know, again, could be mild, you know, could be low, a milder form of novelty, but it finds favor. Again, these are all different kind of considerations, really. But from my point of view, I'm interested in, can you push your novelty, really? That's the thing that I'm particularly interested in. And then, okay, how much can you persuade other people of the value of what you're doing is, depends on how much you want to be that entrepreneurial. You know, there's a different, you could spend a long time pushing one particular product to get it recognized, you know, and I kind of interested in people can come up with a lot of different ideas. Whether it's the same person is an interesting thing, you know, whether the people who come up with the ideas are the same ones who are the ones who get it out there and acknowledged is, you know, I'm up for some discussion about whether that's maybe a different group of people or a different person to do that.
Yeah, that's important as well, and that touches on the ethics around creativity, because creativity, those ideas might come from one place but may be implemented in an entirely different place. And so there's the ethics of, you know, does that creative idea belong to the individual who thought of it, or does it belong to the group, or does it belong to the society or to the culture? Mm-hmm. And what I notice, Karl, is that the academics tend to work in silos, you know, speaking at conferences and sharing, exchanging ideas with other academics rather than with the entrepreneurs, rather than with the educators. And one of the reasons, the rationale behind this conference is to synthesize, you know, create a space where we're not just speaking to others like ourselves who share similar values. You know, there's the academic values, there's the entrepreneurship values, and there's the education values, and it's like cutting across those barriers and synthesizing, because that's where the creativity can occur, when there's diversity of opinion, diversity of values.
Yeah, great. You know, I think that's yeah, there's a value in that, as well as, you know, from when I go to my sort of siloed conferences, there's still things that we have to get our heads around at times, and debate amongst ourselves, and the shared language sometimes is useful for trying to understand where those barriers are, or those contradictions, and what consensus can be achieved. So there's a place for the silo, but not staying in it. You know, I think there's an element to kind of use that to kind of get clear about what's you know, a congruency that can then be brought to a different set of people who've got different views, different ideas on it. And again, the fascinating thing sometimes I found when I go to conferences, and I'm like, I call myself a creativity researcher, but there's another group of people who call themselves innovation trainers, and we're coming from different places, but often we're like, what they say is innovation. I go, oh no, that's what I mean by creativity, and vice versa. So there are differences I think we could tease out, but equally there's a lot of common ground there as well about, and yeah, like you say, there's different values between the education, the profit, if you will, the entrepreneurial side of it, and then the kind of the academic, theoretical kind of relevance or strength of something, and you know, those three are, you get a good discussion going between them.
Okay, well, Dr. Karl Jeffries, thank you very much for this really interesting discussion that we've had, and I look forward to conversing with you further about lots of the interesting subjects that you've raised.
You're welcome. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye for now.